This is the UnShaw podcast, the podcast about atheism, religion, and everything in between.
Winter is coming and we...
Hello, welcome to the UnShaw podcast with me, Robert Shaw. Today we have a gripping guest, David Shipley, whose life journey from a privileged London upbringing to a transformative spiritual awakening and subsequent legal turmoil is truly captivating. Raised by atheist parents with a Catholic background, David was a staunch 90s atheist in his teens, demanding proof for any belief. A seasoned salesman, he even resorted to deceptive tactics to close deals. However, in December 2017, a visit to church on Christmas Day sparked a profound revelation, leading him to embrace faith and receive communion. Shortly after this spiritual shift, David faced the consequences of a law-breaking lie told in 2014. Charged in late 2018, he pleaded guilty in 2019 and was sentenced to prison in 2020. Behind bars, he was appalled by the state of the prison system, sparking a commitment to reform. David utilised his time to write, completing a master's in creative writing and embarking on a PhD in a prison-related field. Join us as we explore David Shipley's remarkable journey, skepticism, spiritual awakening, legal adversity, and a resilient pursuit of change. This is the UnShaw podcast. I'm your host, Robert Shaw. Stay tuned for an impactful conversation with David Shipley. Good evening, David. Thank you for joining me this evening.
Hi, Robert. It's great to be here.
I think it's always good to have a little potted history of your early years. So you were a skeptical child.
I was a vehement atheist from pretty young. I remember refusing to participate in prayers at prep school in assembly when I was 7. And I think even as a pretty young child, I required proof for everything. I suspect I have some kind of autism spectrum disorder because I absolutely needed evidence for everything. So in my very literal child's way, there was no experiment to prove that God existed. There was no video of God. I carried on like that through school, certainly into my 20s. I don't think I even ever flirted with any kind of faith. I spent a lot of time on atheist news groups arguing with Christians. I wanted to prove them wrong.
What did you do after school?
I went to university. I had a funny selection of jobs. I sold forklift trucks for a year. That was in the Birmingham area. Then I moved back to near London and I started working in recruitment. I spent the first decade of the century working in recruitment. At no point did I consider that any religion had any sort of insight into the world.
Was it in recruitment where you subsequently had legal difficulties?
So in 2014, I was in conversation with a private equity firm, and I lied to them. I lied about how much revenue I'd historically generated. And I think had my dishonesty stopped there, although I would have technically broken the law, I would have technically committed a fraud, and I would have clearly have done something very wrong. I think had it stopped there, I wouldn't have ended up in prison. But I went further. So when they asked for evidence, I actually produced a set of fake documents supporting this lie.
So it was a situation where you had to kind of maintain the lie, and perhaps as a result, you dug yourself a deeper hole.
Yes, and for years and years afterwards, until finally the police got in touch, I think I always carried that. I always had this fear of being caught. I've always been quite an imaginative or neurotic person, or both. And I tortured myself. So in a strange way, when the police did get in touch with me in 2018, it was almost a relief. And when I went to go to the interview, I just told them everything I'd done. I didn't try to deny it.
And you do encounter people in that situation where they're almost relieved that the law has caught up with them because it's a bit of a weight off their shoulders. Was that the same for you?
Absolutely. I think it's quite a common response. Well, while I was in prison, I spoke to lots of other men who had committed all sorts of crimes. And when those crimes were committed quite long before the person was caught, the guys would talk about that feeling of relief that they didn't charge me until the end of 2018. I then entered a guilty plea in early 2019, and it wasn't until the beginning of February 2020 that I was actually sentenced. So very long time waiting
Sure. The wheels of justice turn very slowly is a phrase that a lawyer friend of mine uses. But prior to this, you were attending church. Was that sort of special occasions? What was your motivation for these rare visits to church?
My mother's mother was a very, very devout Catholic.
Yeah.
I enjoyed going to midnight mass with her at Christmas time.
Okay.
It was lovely to share the experience with her. I didn't believe, but I'd softened a bit.
Mm-hmm.
When she went up to receive communion, I would sit there and look around.
Yeah.
Then she got very ill and died in 2011. And when I and my family were around the bed in the hospital, my grandmother had a huge and catastrophic stroke. And we knew that she was dying. She wouldn't come out of hospital. I remember it was me who insisted that we get a priest to give her last rites.
I'm presuming that was as a mark of respect rather than any sort of belief in the significance of the last rites.
Yes, I think I believed it was something that she would want, and therefore it was the right thing to do. Didn't think it had any power beyond its personal impact on my grandmother.
Okay, so did you continue going to church on these rare occasions?
We tend to then go on Christmas Eve to midnight mass. And then in 2014 as well, actually, I had a girlfriend for a while who was a very devout Catholic. And we would go to mass every Sunday because that was the thing that she did. I would experience the mass, but I wouldn't receive communion. I said, I'm not even going to go out for a blessing. But I think by this point, my atheism has maybe softened into a more pragmatic agnosticism. And I suppose if asked, I would say, look, it's possible that God exists.
Right.
I've seen no evidence, and therefore I don't believe. And I always said if I was presented with evidence that I couldn't refute, then I would accept it.
Okay, but you're becoming more open to the possibility at this stage.
Yes. Whereas if you'd asked me 10 years before, of course, God doesn't exist, well, nonsense. This is a primitive superstition.
Sure. And then something remarkable happened Christmas Day, 2017.
At this point, my life was okay. There wasn't, I hadn't yet been contacted by the police. That was a few months ahead of me. And I suppose I was, living my life quite normally. I'm not even really sure what took me. There's a lovely, ritualized, familiar, comforting rhythm to mass, and I was there for that day because it was Christmas, and all the people started going up to receive communion towards the end of the mass, and I sat there. I was just thinking, gosh, I don't even know why I'm here. I'm not going to take communion. I don't deserve this. And in that moment, I then had this experience which I find incredibly hard to put into words. I've tried to talk about it to different people at different occasions. I talked about it in sort of religious groups in prison. And I suppose in lots of ways, that is the turning point of my life. Not the crime I committed, not going to prison, not what I've done since. I think that moment is where my life changed. And I was sitting there on the pew, and suddenly the only way I could describe it is if I was no longer in control of my body in any way. I was physically lifted up as though I were a marionette, back of the line, marched forward. The priest offered me communion, and I said amen, and I took it and I received it. Then I was filled with this absolute and utter sense of love and power, like nothing I've experienced before or since. And I found myself back at my seat, weeping tears of joy. And I think I knew in that moment that God was real and Christianity is true. And I had been given the evidence which I'd always said that if I received it, I would be convinced by. For me, that experience was utterly convincing. But, we can't see inside one another's minds. So that story is not necessarily particularly convincing to anyone else. But I suppose the way I think about it is there are different categories of things which are true. I can prove gravity by dropping things. I can prove what the speed of light is by bouncing laser beams off mirrors on the moon. I can't prove in that way that I love my daughter or I love my wife or that they love me. I suppose this revelation I had falls into that category. I do find the timing very interesting, though, because a few weeks later, at the time my life was fine. A few weeks later, I got contacted by the police for the first time, and I then entered a incredibly, difficult, scary, depressing, horrifying period of my life, during which I absolutely considered suicide at times. It came quite close. And I am certain that had I not been given the gift of belief in God, I would not have survived. I would have killed myself. And it's, I think, often when you talk to people about these moments that brought them to God, they come at exactly the right time. They come at exactly the point in someone's life when they needed it.
2 questions, and the UnShaw podcast is all about playing devil's advocate at times. I've spoken to a number of people who went in the other direction to you, i.e. they were brought up in a religious household, they went to church regularly and so on. I've spoken to a number of people and I've asked them the question, have you ever experienced God's love? Have you ever experienced this sense of joy similar to the one it seems like you experienced that Christmas Day in 2017? And a number of them have said no. So what is your explanation for that? Why does God give these life-changing experiences to some people but not to others?
I am not a theologian, but I will do my best with this. In my experience, God is actually really loud. I don't think when he's trying to tell us something, he's actually quiet at all. I think his messages are abundantly clear. I do think, though, that often when people have turned away from faith, I think they may be experiencing profound grief or anger. And in the same way that we might reject people who love us, I think people do, can reject God and force themselves to stop hearing him. So I think more of what's happening is that sort of thing. And I think the human mind is incredibly powerful at retrospectively telling stories. We are storytelling beings. That's our medium and our mode for understanding reality. So I wonder if people who say now, I've never had that experience, perhaps have retrospectively reframed it, or actually they will find their way to faith at some point when they are ready to. So I think those are ways in which I think I might explain that.
My second question is this, David. Do you think that the timing of your revelation was specifically chosen by God, perhaps foreseeing what life had in store for you?
Yes, without question. I think had I found faith in prison or awaiting sentencing, or even just after the police had contacted me, it would be very easy to say, oh, this is, this person is suffering stress, fear, and is turning to faith as a coping strategy.
There was no suggestion that this was going to happen to you?
Absolutely not at all. I'd lived with this generalised sense that it might come out for years and years and years, but other than that, I had no reason to think this was something which was happening or coming for me. And I think that certainly for me makes the revelation all the more convincing. Even I step away from the personal experience of it, I think the fact that it came at a time when it was just before I would really need it, it's really powerful. And I do believe, yes, that God chose that day, that moment to, I almost don't want to say give me faith, because I feel like I don't have faith. I just felt God and experienced God, and I know he's there now. And I don't have faith in him any more than I have faith that the sun will rise tomorrow, or that up is up and down is down.
So are you one of these people who says, yeah, I don't believe in God, I know God is there?
Yes, I think to the same degree of certainty that I am convinced the sun will rise in the morning.
Okay. So tell us about the first contact from the police and how you felt.
I got a letter from them in January of 2018. So this is 3 or 4 weeks after my conversion. And they invited me to come for an interview. It's all very, very odd and civilized. If it's a historic white-collar fraud offence, that you get treated oddly differently. And that there's that thread throughout the justice system, actually, that if you're a white man with my kind of accent, you do get treated better.
Yeah.
And that was noticeable in prison as well. But I eventually went for an interview with my solicitor in, I think, April of 2018. Sat with them for 2 hours talking about everything. They then asked me to come back for another interview in August and eventually charged me in October. And the court systems being in the parlous and underfunded and backlog state that they are, I eventually put a guilty plea in the following spring, so spring of 2019. And actually, the court systems are worse now. There are people waiting years.
Sure. And do you think your revelation and your relationship with God influenced your honesty during questioning by the police?
That's a really good question. I hadn't considered it in those terms before. I certainly, when I saw what they wanted to talk to me about, what they called the disclosure, I didn't consider for a second lying about it, which is odd because I'd spent years of my life lying. I sort of learned to lie as a boy at prep school as a way of keeping myself emotionally safe and hidden from the world. And I built those skills in these sales jobs.
Mm-hmm.
And I obviously, lied in a gross and appalling way when I committed the fraud I committed. But at no point did I consider lying to the police in that situation. And I might have been able to. They didn't actually have the sort of the smoking gun, the physical evidence of my fake documents. Those have been mislaid or lost at some point. So I think they had someone saying they thought they'd seen this letter, but that was it. So perhaps I could have tried to bluster and blag my way out of it, but I didn't in any way think that didn't even enter my head. So perhaps that's because I had found God and become a Christian. I don't know.
Potentially, do you see yourself maybe, had you not had that experience and you were the same person that you were prior, that you might have tried to bluff your way out of it maybe?
Yeah, I think it's certainly possible. I spent my childhood and early adulthood bluffing and blagging my way out of everything. So I went further than a lot of people would go, but I think these things are on a continuum. I think there are industries and jobs and cultures which incentivize
bending the truth a little bit.
Yeah, I think there's sort of a fake it till you make it culture is often spoken about. And I'm not saying that's an excuse. I'm a morally responsible agent. I made the choice I made. But I do think there are workplace cultures which build habits. And I think I'm with Aristotle on this. I think that virtue is a habit in lots of ways. And I think I'd spent decades building the habit of lying. And without a worldview shifting experience like my conversion, I probably would have carried on.
So 2019 must have been a very stressful time for you.
Yes, in a number of pretty significant ways. I would say the year I spent awaiting sentencing was far, far worse and harder psychologically and emotionally than the 18 months or so I spent in prison.
Wow.
It was awful because it wasn't that I put a guilty plea and they said, okay, great, it's March the 30th, 2019 now. It was something like that. Come back on February the 6th, 2020, then we'll sentence you. That would have been manageable. I would have known I had 11 months. I would have been able to make plans. Perhaps I would have studied language or written a book or something. Instead, I went through this succession of being asked to come back in 4 weeks, in 6 weeks, in 7 weeks, in 8 weeks. Just again and again and again. And each time I thought I would be sentenced. So each time I would turn up with my bag, my suitcase, packed to prison, and not know if I was coming home or if I was going to prison. And the really difficult thing about that is, 4 to 6 weeks is pretty much not enough time to do anything really. You can sort of start a bit of a fitness plan. You can't even do couch to 5K in 6 weeks. And I think it asks for 12, doesn't it? So there's nothing you can do. So every 4, 6, 8 weeks, I would have this cathartic few hours of just like relief and release, and I'd probably go to the pub with some friends and drink quite a lot. And then the tension would just ratchet up day after day after day as we came closer to the next day. And it was really tough.
So you, at this stage, you are expecting to go to prison. Is that pretty much, was that a foregone conclusion?
I think it was always very likely.
Yeah.
The judge would have had to agree with some quite marginal technical arguments on the scale of the amount that I should be sentenced on. So I think it was always pretty unlikely that I would be escaping prison.
So you've talked about how alcohol helped you during this time in your life. What strength did you get from your faith?
A lot. So I was going to Mass a lot at that time, most days, I would say, in 2019. And it was a huge comfort. I'm not sure alcohol was particularly helpful. I think I was using it to numb and suppress.
To forget.
Well, not to forget, but just I think it was odd, particularly on the days where I'd attended court. Afterwards, I would be full of adrenaline, shaking, full of cortisol, and I think I was essentially self-medicating on those days by drinking quite a lot. It was not a healthy life choice, or one that I would recommend, but I think that's what was driving it. And I don't really drink anymore. So maybe have a glass of wine on my birthday.
So you eventually received your prison sentence in February 2020, which, if my memory serves me rightly, was just before the COVID pandemic sort of set in, wasn't it?
Yes. While I was in prison, I kept a journal that I wrote every day. And if I look back to the first few days, I'd mention the first repatriation flight of Brits coming back from China. So that was happening just as I was in my first few days in Wandsworth Prison. And then I had 6 or 7 weeks of normal prison, if I can put it that way. And prison's never normal.
Sure.
Prison operating the way it's supposed to, or at least the way it normally did pre-COVID. And then Boris announced the lockdown. And then we entered a period where we were in our cells for 23 and a half, 24 hours a day. And that went on for a number of months. And that was a really, really tough time where just trying to stay sane was difficult, I think, for many of us.
But presumably you had your newfound relationship with God. That must have been of some solace to you.
Yeah, I did a lot of praying, a lot of, when I couldn't sleep at night, a lot of talking to God, a lot of thinking back about different points in my life when I could have many different choices. And sort of simulating alternate life paths, I suppose. And I was lucky that I had a really good cellmate. He and I had been working in the library together, and we'd got them to put us in a cell together about 3 or 4 days before lockdown happened. So we got on well. We played board games. We played a lot of chess. We managed to get some other board games. We played those. We chatted a lot. There's an intimacy in that relationship when you're sharing a cell for 8 or 9 months, as we did, a space the size of a car parking space.
Wow.
That's your cell. And within that, you've both got a bed, you've got, your toilet, a little sink, that's where you eat, that's where you keep your property, that's where you live, that's your home. And during COVID, we were spending, as I said, 23 and a half, 24 hours a day inside that space. So in some ways, it's more intimate than a marriage. So we talked a lot. Yeah, it was a tough time, but I certainly my belief, I guess, in God helped me a lot. My writing helped a lot. Writing a journal I found hugely, hugely helpful.
I've heard a lot of testimony from people who have spent time in prison, and there are some people who say, it gives you a real opportunity to take stock, to reflect on your life. Did you have a similar experience?
Yes, and I would not recommend a prison sentence as a way of achieving personal growth, but it absolutely can be that. There's something about losing everything that makes you an individual out in the world, the things you covered, the career, the status, all that's gone. And you're just a prisoner with a number and so. And you have a lot of time, particularly during COVID, but even now, people spend 22 or 23 hours a day in their cells. So there's a lot of time to think, and as I did, to reflect on the choices I had made. And I went to prison. I was determined that I would leave in better shape than I went in. And I was really fat when I went in as well. I think I'd been, not really exercising properly, eating too much because of all the stress. I said, from time to time drinking too much as well. And I was determined to not be fat and to be in moral, spiritual, psychological and emotional health on the way out the door. A big part of that was actually dissecting all of my life choices, because I had to be certain that I wasn't going to lie like that again, to commit a crime like that again, to do that to myself and to other people again.
Sure.
And that took a lot of interrogating myself.
Now, here's an interesting question for you. Do you think your prison sentence and time spent in prison was part of God's plan for you?
Oh, yes, absolutely. I was, before I got sentenced, I was praying to be spared jail. But actually, I think going to prison really opened my eyes. It's rare that our politics change profoundly when we're in our late 30s or early 40s, but mine did. And that's because of what I saw in prison. And not just how poorly functioning our justice system is and how dreadful our prisons are, but actually just my eyes were opened to the iniquity and unfairness in our society. And I met a lot of men in prison who had far, far more excuse than I did for being there. I had no excuse. I had a privileged upbringing. I didn't need to lie. I didn't have any pressing economic, required. I didn't have a family to feed that were dependent on me lying. I did it out of pride. But there are lots of people in prison who can barely read or write. 60% of prisoners don't have the reading capacity that's expected of an 11-year-old in this country.
Sure.
And my eyes were open to the level of suffering and deprivation in our society. When I left prison, I felt charged with a purpose. I feel very strongly that I didn't really do anything or very little of kind of moral worth or purpose or value. The experience of being in prison has changed the direction of my life and given me clarity about what I should be doing and given me an opportunity to talk about these issues, to raise awareness of what's wrong with our prison system. I'm doing a PhD researching the impact of parental imprisonment on children. Everything I do now is focused around these issues.
I remember hearing a quote from a seasoned criminal who said something like, "I'm not a bad person, I just played the cards I was dealt." Does that describe some people you encountered in prison?
I do think that everyone has free will, moral agency and choice. But I also recognise that agency and freedom of choice can be materially constrained by our upbringing, by the habits we learn as a child, and by our material conditions. So I think a lot of people in prison are there because the way they make their money is illegal. You do meet a lot of people who are there for dealing drugs.
Okay.
And of course that's illegal, and of course there is social harm done by drugs. But had they had a different upbringing, they would probably be doing something to make money which is socially and legally acceptable. And I think it's hard to see a person who deals drugs as, evil. And I think there are very few truly sort of bad people in that sense. I do, however, also believe that people have choice. And you could sort of see in prison the guys who were not going to go back. And I think the attitude to rule breaking, to moral choice is a big part of that.
So what are your main criticisms of the justice system and the prison system in the UK?
Oh gosh, how long have we got?
Indeed.
This could be a podcast series in its own. So very quickly, I think the justice system pre-prison is struggling. The police solve almost no crimes. Maybe 5 or 10% of crimes. That's a huge issue. Then the courts are sclerotic and backlogged, so it can take years for people's court cases to reach trial. And that's terrible for everyone. If you're a victim of crime and you have to wait 5 or 6 years for a trial where you give evidence, then you're trapped in that trauma. You can't achieve catharsis until that's happened.
And presumably it's a very difficult and stressful time for the defendant as well.
Well, absolutely. And I think there's probably less sympathy for defendants, but not all defendants are guilty, and people have to put their life on hold for years. I know one lady who spent, I think, 6 years awaiting trial. It kept getting put back, and eventually the CPS offered no evidence.
Wow.
So there's these kinds of behaviours are ridiculous and damaging. And then when we do send people to prison, I think the system itself teaches the opposite moral lessons that we would hope, in that it teaches inmates that rule breaking is a good thing. It's actually rewarded. It teaches that antisocial behaviour is rewarded. It teaches that compliance with social order is bad because you'll have a worse time in prison. And further, we do nothing meaningful to look at why people have offended and why they are there and what they can do to change their lives. And, what we should be doing is every single person who arrives in prison, we know how long they're going to be there. We would be building out an individual bespoke program, some mixture of therapy, training, education and work, such that when they leave prison, which 95% or more of all prisoners will do, when that person leaves prison, we want them to be as unlikely as possible to reoffend and as likely as possible to become a positive pro-social member of society. So what we have is a prison system which does none of that and which is violent and dangerous, can't retain staff, creates much greater levels of mental illness and physical ill health, in some cases actively kills people who are imprisoned through callous disregard for their safety or simple institutional disinterest in them.
Yeah.
We should be absolutely appalled and shamed by our prison system.
So there's very little emphasis, in your opinion, on rehabilitating criminals?
I think the only rehabilitation that really goes on in prisons is done by prisoners themselves to themselves. Well, I think there is an exception to that in that we do some quite effective work with murderers and with particularly violent criminals. And some of those programs, I think, are helpful and effective. I certainly got to know and became friends with murderers towards the end of my prison sentence who'd spent very long periods of time in prison, 10, 15, 20 years. And some of them clearly had benefited from the intense therapy to help them understand what they had done, understand why they had killed, and help them come to terms with that and be able to move forward as a healed human being who wouldn't kill again. So I think that is the exception, but we really restrict that to a pretty small number of prisoners. Almost everyone in prison is there for fraud, drugs, and sex offences. If you're there for fraud or drugs, you might get some cursory courses on victim awareness and this sort of thing, and being better at planning your finances. Sex offenders get a whole raft of courses, some of which have been actually shown to increase their risk of reoffending. So that's bad.
Mm.
And other than that, there's not really any serious effort to rehabilitate, which is catastrophic because the estimate by the government about 4 or 5 years ago was that reoffending was costing us £18 billion a year. With inflation, that must be substantially higher now. I haven't seen an updated figure, but I would guess it's got to be somewhere in the early to mid-20s every year. So that's the cost of reoffending. Plus there's a social cost. There's the fact that the children of prisoners suffer and are more likely to themselves end up in criminality and even end up in prison as a result of having a parent in prison. So there's so much damage done by reoffending.
So did you discuss your faith with fellow inmates during this time?
Yes, absolutely. With other Christians, with Muslims, with non-believers, and in informal contexts and in formal, sort of semi-formal contexts. Like there was an Alpha group I did at Holsey Bay, the prison that I finished at. I think one of the interesting ones early on actually was talking to a Muslim prisoner, and I was expressing what is very mainstream Catholic teaching on pornography, and that it's wrong, it's grossly sinful, and it degrades everyone involved in its production and consumption. And he was really surprised to hear me saying it. He said, "I've never heard like a white man and non-Muslim saying that's a man before." And I was like, this is literally mainstream Christian doctrine. And it was quite interesting actually to find that we had, in terms of our sort of moral positions on these kinds of issues, we had a lot in common.
And did you manage to, for want of a better word, convert anyone during your time inside?
I think the best way to convert or proselytize is not to sit down with people and say, "You've got to read this book, let me talk to you about Jesus." Or certainly not for me anyway. For me, the best advertisement for Christianity is how we live, how we exhibit our faith. You know, I would walk around both Wandsworth Prison and Holsey Bay Prison. I would say hello to everyone. I would always try to have a smile on my face. I'd be as cheerful as I possibly could be. And, you know, when people ask me why I'm so happy, I would say, well, you know, a big part of it is God. I don't know if anyone shifted their view as a result. There were certainly some guys on the Alpha course who were, I think, were a lot closer to belief by the end of it than at the beginning. I'm not sure how much of that was me. I suppose the only conversion I can really claim is a friend of mine who, before I went to prison, she was sort of kind of believed in Catholicism, but she'd never got baptized. I did eventually nudge her into starting the classes. So I think that's the only technical conversion that I can claim.
You touched on this point a little bit earlier. You said you didn't encounter any genuinely evil people in prison, just genuinely good people who had followed the wrong path.
I did encounter one genuinely evil person in prison, but she was a prison officer, not a prisoner. Most prison officers are not terrible people or brutal authoritarians that you might imagine from the movies. Most of them are fairly disinterested in their jobs. They might be a bit, you know, petty and bullying, but it's like any job. There are some people who are really good. There are some people who are rubbish and just turn up and don't really care. There's a bunch of people in the middle. This particular woman, though, I think is the only genuinely evil human being I've ever met. And there are lots of stories I could tell about her, and everyone on H-Wing in Wandsworth had a very similar view of her. Like, she was universally reviled and loathed by all prisoners, no matter their creed or colour or offence or age.
What type of things did she do?
I think the best way to describe it is that her greatest pleasure in life was applying a rule, enforcing a rule, when she knew it would hurt someone. And this would be, you know, telling people that they had to get, you know, someone had just gone onto the phone and was speaking to their mum, their wife, their kids, and if it was the end of association time, or that group of people were supposed to go back into their cells, she would enforce that. Whereas most officers would be humane about it and say that you've got 5 minutes, you know. Or she would, you know, tell people they had to get back into their cells, they couldn't have a shower that day because that was a rule, these sorts of things. And when we said, oh, come on, you know, we need a shower, he's talking to his wife, she's ill, whatever it is, I remember this woman would say, oh, well, those are the rules, and we've got to follow the rules, haven't we, or where would we be? And I think in that moment, I recognised what the people who worked in the death camps must have been like. You hear these stories of these studious, normal men and women who would have breakfast with their spouse and children and then go off to work in the extermination camps. You know, would just do their job, just following the rules, just getting things done. And then they would cheerfully go home and eat dinner and think nothing of it and take pleasure in doing a good job. And I had never understood how those sorts of human beings could be or could exist until I met this woman. And she had very clearly had that same joy in following the rules, even and especially when enforcing them would hurt other human beings.
Tell me about life when you came out of prison.
Gosh, so I was halfway through doing a creative writing MA. I moved to Wales. After all the noise and the crowding of Wandsworth particularly, and of prison in general, I knew I wanted to be somewhere quiet and rural and with the sound of running water around. So I moved to Monmouthshire, and in a few months I met the woman who's now my wife. Fell in love with her. We both fell in love with each other, and I finished my MA. The following spring, I ended up going back into prison as a prison inspector, which was unexpected. I think perhaps it was on some level an effort to make the object of my trauma safe by taking power over it. But that was an interesting experience. And I've written about prison, spoken about prison. I write on prison justice issues regularly for The Spectator and other places. I have often appeared in various media places talking about what prison's like. Got married. We had a baby this summer.
Oh, congratulations.
Yeah, thank you. No, so I think I feel inordinately and undeservedly blessed.
And returning to a question which I posed earlier, is this God's plan for you to campaign for more compassion in the justice system and the prison system?
I think so. Yeah. I think prison is this hidden world which is so poorly understood that those of us who've been there and have some kind of platform or voice are obliged to do something with it.
Your vocation.
My vocation, yes, indeed, very, very Catholic. But my vocation, that's good. I'll steal that. Yeah, I think this is very much what God wants me to do. And when you're doing what you're supposed to do, what you're made for, there's a joyful sense of rightness. I don't know if you play any sports.
Does snooker and pool count?
Snooker and pool absolutely count. So there's an experience when you're playing any kind of sport, doing anything that's hard, when you do it perfectly. You cue the ball absolutely perfectly, bounce them off the cushions, and it goes exactly where you wanted it to, and you do the pot. And that experience, that sense of absolute rightness, I think, for me, when I put a perfect tackle in rugby, take a perfect shot, it's just joyful. And my experience certainly is in life when I am doing the things that are right for me, that are good, that are what God wants me to be doing, I feel that absolute sense of perfection and rightness.
So what is life like for you now?
Very quiet. I'm I say quite busy, but not sort of in a noisy way. I'm doing a PhD, so I'm researching the impact of parental imprisonment on children. So that will keep me busy for the next few years. I have almost finished the rewrites on my novel. I'm hoping to start work on a non-fiction book, which isn't a prison book, but it's about me and 3 other men who I became good friends with in prison, who were all born around the same time in England, and it's telling our stories. And I do journalism. I have a 6-month-old baby who's demanding, as 6-month-old babies are. She's awesome, though. I'm trying to run more this year.
So just going back to the topic of your PhD, how would you describe the experiences of children whose parents are in prison, or one of their parents is in prison?
It's more complex than people necessarily realise. I think there's a lot of narratives around the idea that the problem is that children don't get to see dad when he's in prison. It's mostly dad. And that is true for a substantial cohort. And it's also true that children who have a parent in prison are often more likely to have difficulties at school, to have difficulties with authority, get into problems with the law, maybe even end up in prison themselves. All those things are true. But also, often, there's a big chunk of children for whom dad is not a joyful, trusted figure of love. Dad may well be the person who beats up mum. About a third of children with a parent in prison don't really have any contact with them at all. And that is often because they don't want to. So it's complex, and these children and young people can have very challenging and conflicting emotions about their parent being in prison. Sometimes they'll feel sad that their parent's in prison, but also actually quite like it, because when dad's in prison, that's the one time he's consistent with his contact, because he's got nothing else to do. So he phones every week or every day, he writes letters, and once he's out, he disappears again. Or they might feel that they're pleased that this scary person is in prison. I'm always struck by, I give lectures from time to time at universities across the country talking about what prison's like. And I gave a lecture up at Worcester last year, and afterwards this young lady came up to talk with me, and she blurted out this story that her father had abused her when she was a child, and she was giving evidence against him. And she explained that she'd been really feeling fired up about giving evidence in his trial in a few weeks and seeing her abused and punished. But after listening to my talk, she was now feeling conflicted and saying that she was worried about sending her father to prison. And I suppose there's something very human in that, isn't there? We can hold those two absolutely conflicting and incredibly powerful emotions simultaneously, the desire to punish the abuser and the desire to protect the father. That's quite a long-winded way of saying that it's very complex. I'm 4 or 5 months into the PhD, so I think I'm at the stage where I'm becoming aware of how complex this space is.
So a final question for you, David. What does a prison and justice system that conforms to Christian principles look like?
I think in addition to all the practical areas that I've talked about. One way I think we are really struggling as a society now is that we don't have a mechanism for redemption. I think we are functionally a post-Christian society, certainly in the West. And there's a very Old Testament attitude, and we see this with the children of prisoners. Children are often blamed for their father's sins in a very Exodus way. The sins of the father are visited upon the son to the third or fourth generation. And we also, I don't think, really have a mechanism for recognizing that someone has sinned against society, against people, has committed a crime, has been punished for it, and has found some way to redemption. And you see this even outside of crime, right? When people get cancelled and that's it, it's over. Because someone says something which has offended, hurt, shocked people. And I do think we need more Christian mercy, and we need a way of, as a society and within our justice system, of facilitating and recognising the possibility of redemption.
Okay, David, thank you for joining us on the UnShaw podcast today. I found your experience and your insights truly fascinating. If you want to make contact with David, you can do so via his Twitter account, and that is at Shipley Writes. That's Writes as in WRITES, at Shipley Writes. Thanks again for joining us, David.
Thanks so much.